Hi, Dr. Amy Salerno, Doctora Latina, also known as Draw Latina, back briefly to revisit the question of PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder, specifically some tools that people that maybe are listening tonight can learn from. I had the honor of having and the privilege of having Jules from Allegedly Innocent on a couple of different live streams recently, and we really got into the nuts and bolts on an organic and physiologic basis about trauma and how it affects people acutely and chronically. And I just wanted to swing back through and talk a little bit more generally and give you guys a bit of maybe some tips that you all could use that might help you all. Again, I'm not here to diagnose anybody specifically. I'm here for educational reasons. And my purpose really is to uplift the true crime community, whether it's content creators, followers, subs, members, and victims of crime. And what I've found over the past couple of years as a follower of true crime on YouTube is that a lot of people admit in chats that they themselves have been victimized, especially as children and adolescents. And I think with the very fractured medical system that we have in the United States, especially in the past decade or so, getting mental health care and services is a really difficult thing, especially if you fall between the cracks. If you have no money and you're indigent, if you have Medicaid, Medicare, and most even private insurances have a very, very long waiting list to see a mental health specialist, specifically a social worker, counseling social worker, a certified counselor, psychologist, and psychiatrist. So I am acutely aware as a practicing physician and psychiatrist that the lines are long and it really is difficult. Now, part one of this series that I'm doing on tips to help people with PTSD and a history of trauma is going to focus a bit on childhood and adolescence, if you've been victimized in your childhood, early childhood, and you are a survivor. Okay. And I call this sort of section that I'm focusing on as restoration. And my question is restoration from trauma in early childhood possible? And it absolutely is possible, even if you are unable to obtain counseling from a mental health professional. Now, the way I see trauma, what I'm specifically talking about is childhood neglect. So having not enough attention by a parent, being left to fend for yourself, not getting enough food can be a type of trauma. There's psychological trauma, for example, name calling by a parent. There's physical trauma, and there's also SA. These are just a couple of types of trauma that children can go through. And if their parents and grandparents endured the same, then often we get what's known as intergenerational trauma. And it just sort of feeds on itself and is propelled from one generation to the other. And the goal is, how do we break intergenerational trauma so that our children, our grandchildren don't continue the cycle of abuse and trauma? Some very simple ways. I think there are 5 that I want to start with, and that would be to break intergenerational trauma. We can start by having a reflection ourselves and looking at our sense of guilt, shame, and fear that are the result of the trauma we might have experienced as a youngster. So self-reflection, being able to look inside yourself and naming not only what happened to you, but acknowledging the guilt, the shame, and the fear, thinking somehow that you might be the only person that ever went through that. So if you can name those feelings, that's a huge first step. And then the next piece is to find a trusted friend, not somebody that's going to go out and tell the world, not somebody on the internet that you've never met or whom you've never met, but somebody with whom you've had a good friendship for a while that seems grounded and mature. And I also tell all of my adolescent and child patients, pediatric patients, that it is important young in life to begin to look. Do you have a trusted friend? But more importantly, is there a trusted adult out there that you can rely on? And it's the same for folks that are adults already. We need to find a trusted friend and begin to share a little bit. And just those first two steps, self-reflection, recalling the incidences of trauma, naming your feelings, which are most commonly with PTSD and history of trauma, are guilt, shame, and fear. And step two is trying to find that trusted friend. That can begin the breakthrough towards restoration. Of course, counseling, that's huge. If you have a church community that you go to, there may indeed be counselors on staff. Even if you can't find a professional counselor within the medical community, you might be able to find a pastor or your church staff that could be of help to you. You know, we're all broken. And stopping that sense of one's own self-talk of shame and guilt and realizing that every person that you meet along the way is broken. And if we can stop comparing ourselves to others, I'm more broken than they are, they're more broken than I am. Stopping that comparison to others in your life is the next step towards restoration. And when we begin to realize that we are all broken people and that our trauma may not be the same, but it doesn't mean that we're worse off or better off. Stopping the comparison is step three. That can really help you. And then, of course, I've talked over the past couple of weeks the importance of understanding those trauma responses. The five that I talk about: the fight, the fright, the freeze, and then the fawn response and the flop response. And I'm going to briefly talk about the importance of you recognizing what is your trauma response. It could be more than just one of the five, obviously. But is it fight? Is it flight? Is it freeze? Is it fawning over people? Is it flopping, or just kind of losing consciousness, or just lying there saying, I can't do anything? Once you recognize your trauma response, the goal is for you to begin to create boundaries between yourself and others so that when things begin to trigger you, you've created a clear boundary that you're not going to get involved in arguments or whatever it is that is your trigger. Another goal is to become more assertive, to be able to say, I have a voice. I have agency, which is the new term. I can be assertive and say what it is that I want. Not aggressiveness, not bowling people over, but being assertive and using your agency in a courteous and civil way. So boundaries, being and learning assertiveness, becoming a strong leader in your own life, a leader for your children and coworkers and for those folks around you. and also learning to protect yourself and your loved ones when necessary. So those are the goals for restoration. Okay. Now I'm going to go through some of the unhealthy trauma responses that you'll see in each of these little 5 responses. And then what are the healthy trauma responses? Because actually, each trauma response is associated with certain unhealthy patterns of behavior, but they're also associated with certain positive, protective behaviors. So an example for the fight trauma response, the unhealthy things would be things like the person becomes very controlling in their behaviors. They become very narcissistic and thinking only about themselves because they're fighting for themselves. Bullying is an example of a fight trauma response. Conduct disorders, often we see those in children where they have oppositional, defiant responses to authority and also breaking things, etc. Demanding perfection from others is a fight trauma response. And feelings of entitlement, that you deserve everything or deserve something special, is a fight trauma response. That is unhealthy. Now, healthy responses to both fight and flight responses would be things like disengaging yourself from harmful conversations, leaving unhealthy relationships, and that is difficult, removing yourself physically from dangerous situations, and learning to properly assess a dangerous situation. We talked last week, Jules did, about how the brain is constantly, in an unconscious fashion, constantly on alert. And for those folks that have been traumatized, they are even hyper alert and hyper vigilant. So learning not to be hyper vigilant and hyper responsive to perceived danger, but learning to properly assess one's risk for danger. Unhealthy flight responses, so a flight would be sort of to run away, would be things like staying busy all the time, being in constant panic and fear, causing you just to want to fly away, so to speak. Perfectionism, workaholism, because it takes you away from your feelings. You're flying away from having to look at your feelings and you bury yourself in work. Inability to sit still. So you might not be a workaholic, but you might be that person that has to go to the gym, has to stay in shape, has to be in a million different activities to stay busy in order to fly away from your trauma. So the goals, again, would be to recognize what your traumas were and to try to learn to sit with those uncomfortable feelings, learn to disengage if you need to from harmful, unsafe conversations and situations, but also to learn to properly assess danger so that you don't have to fly away from perceived danger. With the freeze trauma response, we often will see dissociation. So the brain sort of takes you away from reality. We see isolation. People may be avoidant of relationships, avoidant of friendships, even avoidant of work. Frequent zoning out. When they become uncomfortable, they kind of zone out of the conversation. Brain fog. They might have difficulty making decisions because they get frozen in what should I do sort of thing. Should I do this? Should I do that? There's a perception the person might be lazy because they just don't act or they are not proactive in their activities of daily living, etc. So people might perceive that person as lazy. So instead of us saying, is she lazy or is he lazy? Perhaps that's their flight trauma response. And what's really interesting is also a trauma flight response is um, fear of achieving, fear of sticking to something and saying, I'm going to get really good at this and I'm going to become successful. And fear of trying something new, whether it's a hobby, a job, or a relationship. Those are very common freeze responses. And again, the healthy goal of a trauma response, mindfulness, awareness, trying to be fully present in the moment without dissociating, without zoning out, having brain fog. In Spanish, we call mindfulness atención plena, full attention in the present moment. The fawning trauma response, what we see when people fawn is they become codependent in their relationships. They're people pleasers. They never really find themselves because they're so busy trying to fawn over their loved ones, trying to help other people. They have little or poor boundaries because they're so busy trying to indulge other people, fawn over other people because in their trauma response, they learned that being kind and saccharine and super duper sweet was a way to placate their abuser. And we often find people who have fawn responses they remain in violent relationships. And the goal that we give people who have that fawn response are 4 things. Learning to be compassionate with yourself so that you don't feel you have to fawn over other people to prove to them that you're a good person. Learning to compromise. Learning to say, I don't want to do this. Instead of saying, whatever it is you want, honey, or whatever it is my child wants, instead saying, let's compromise. What I want is important. That's a way to stop fawning. To actively listen to other people. Fawners often will try to anticipate what the world around them wants, try to please what they perceive as what is best to placate others, rather than stopping and waiting and listening and saying, what really is it that is wanted by this person, by my job, etc. So stopping, figuring out what others really want, not necessarily what you think they want, what you think they might want so that they can be pleased by you. And healthy fawning would be an example that you are a person of fairness. So in other words, you don't have to completely change your trauma response. In this example of being a fawning person, you can still be a kind person, a compassionate person, an active listener. Listen. A person who is able to compromise but not be stepped upon. And just a person who is willing to own their mistakes and not be super duper judgmental of the people with whom they interact. So in the end of the day, the goal of restoration for folks who have either had early childhood trauma, are victims of crime even in their adulthood, is to first figure out which one of the 5 trauma responses you have, to try to figure out whether you have, which of the unhealthy responses within that category do you have, and how can you turn those behaviors around and use your trauma response in a positive way that will lead to your self-restoration and to the restoration of your relationships with others. So the question I asked at the beginning, is restoration from trauma possible? Absolutely. Can you do it? Yes, you can. Step 1 is self-reflection. Step 2 is to find what in that self-reflection are your feelings. Are they based on shame, guilt, fear? So identifying those. The next step is find that trusted friend, and doing all of that, hopefully in anticipation of getting professional counseling or counseling within a church community by a professional. Reminding ourselves that we are all broken and that in order to obtain restoration, you do not have to compare yourself with others. You are unique in your humanity, and there's no reason to compare your brokenness with others because that will only keep you down. And the final step towards that restoration is to understand your trauma responses. I hope this helped you guys. It's very much an overview of healing from trauma. But I think in the true crime community, we must begin to self-reflect so that we can understand what it is we're looking at, what it is we're discussing when we are talking about cases, current or past, of criminality. All right, guys, I'll see you actually this Friday, the 27th, I believe it is, of January at 8:30 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. And we're going to be looking live stream at the story of Trinity Backus from Northern California, 16-year-old girl that went missing, found deceased. And I will be reviewing with two panel guests Trinity Backus's autopsy and what clues the autopsy may show that on first blush we may not have seen. See you then. Bye-bye.